Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Contemplative Science podcast. My name is Jamie, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, man?
Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm very, very good. And this week, I say this a lot that I'm especially excited, but I actually am especially excited this week too, because we have a very good friend of mine and also a colleague of mine, Jonas Mago, that I'll let you introduce, but I think we're going to have some great topics to talk about today.
Yeah, so today we do have Jonas Mago on the show. Jonas is a cognitive neuroscientist and well-being aficionado. He's interested in a bunch of stuff, but basically that means the cognitive mechanisms underlying human flourishing. So he's looked at meditation and prayer and collective cultural rituals and psychedelic therapies. He's currently pursuing his doctoral studies in neuroscience at McGill University, and we are really excited to have him on today. Jonas, how are you, mate?
Hey Jamie, hey Mark. I'm doing great and stoked to be on the show. Thank you so much for this
Thanks.
kind invite.
Very
So
good.
we're gonna be talking about peak experiences and particularly something called jhanas. So what is a jhana? Because most people haven't heard of one.
Yeah, and I think the short form is that jhanas are very deep concentration states. There's this term called shamatha, which is kind of the meditation of concentration. And if you kind of pursue the shamatha path, at some point concentration will become much, much more stable and something that is called absorption happens. And during absorptions, it's almost like you put in a lot of effort in concentrating. I think everyone who started to meditate and tried to sit down for a few minutes notices how hard that might be. And there's a
Mm.
little bit of a tipping point where at some point it's like surfing, like on the surfboard, it's so much effort to pedal, and at some point you're just on the wave and you just relax and you chill on your surfboard. And I feel like that's the best thing you've ever experienced. And that's, I think, broadly speaking, what a jhana is. At some point, meditation keeps picking up. There's strong joy or piti arising, and then through different stages, you can refine that more and more. And I would say it's probably one of the most concentrated and most stable states of mind that is accessible to us humans.
How do you know if one's happening?
Well, it's probably one of the biggest challenges to talk about that very accurately because very different teachers have very different um, definitions of what would count as a jhana and when you're kind of in that and not in that. So I think all I say, like, there's a few different views, and I think there's a lot of value in kind of not defining things too strongly here and studying these different perspectives. But
Yeah,
it,
like there really is a kind of jhana wars today, isn't there, amongst sort of Dharma communities?
mm,
It's like you have a gradated scale from very shallow things that people say, okay, well, that's a jhana, all the way to extremely deep. The deepest ones, you have teachers who say it doesn't really count as a jhana unless you're in it for a kind of hour and there's no blemish, there's no breakthrough of any other kind of quality. Rather, you have just an excluded experience filled with only a particular kind of factor, like either joy or peace and nothing else. So no sound or nor feeling. And at the shallow end, you can have lots of stuff going on, but you're still, would you say, Jonas, like Jonas, is the major thing is just that you have some amount of exclusion. So you're getting rid of some data, and the factors that are associated, like you said already, like joy, maybe that's coming up. Is that maybe? I think that's probably shared across the board.
exactly, I think that's a great definition. I think there's these jhana factors which are very easily to recognize because they're so strong. There's joy or piti, there's equanimity or like kind of is a calmness of mind. Um, and then at some point it's like from when I talk with these participants or the meditators that we're working with, and if I ask them what for them jhana is, they always talk about like a switch that's turned around where at some point distractions just fade and you're just like you kind of pop into something. And I think that is probably a very important thing to have both the factors there and then to kind of come across this threshold where distraction is just like numbed. And then there is a bit of difference of how much it must be numbed in order to be a jhana.
And I love that. I love that you just said hit a pocket. I think you're right. That's a really nice characteristic, and it's one of the reasons why we think it's interesting to look at it scientifically, isn't it? Because there is like a definitive altered state experience where you hit it and then you can lose it, and you can hit it and you can lose it.
And that's exactly, I think, what the fascinating things about these jhana states, that when we like these peak experiences, they're all over the place. You can induce them by like holotropic breathing, or you can take psychedelics. All of them do something like alter your experience very fundamentally and like almost like the shift. But there's something in jhana that is very different. Where here you're not pushing yourself into these states and kind of just almost like break the architecture. You very finely try to like almost search, and it's almost like an artistic process of finding the state that feels so comfortable. And it's this search and this like with very high accuracy navigating into this little pocket. And I think that's what makes these people so extraordinary, that they can use their attention to navigate there instead of using kind of more forceful approaches, like forceful.
Yes, it's not like an LSD trip at all. I mean, that's just like the Wild West, right? You're talking about something very subtle, very refined, and potentially very controllable. How interesting.
Exactly.
Is there a spiritual significance to these things necessarily? Like, if you're having a jhana, does that necessarily mean something interesting is happening spiritually, or is it possible to have one without that significance?
Wonderful. I think that's a great question. Something that is very core to what I'm trying to figure out here. Jhanas are said to be like great and fertile ground to develop insight. And there's something really valuable, like once you come out of these jhana states, where something really healing and meaningful can happen. And interestingly, some of the teachers and some of these really advanced teachers that I've been speaking with, they tend to say that the jhana experience itself is not even that relevant or that crucial. Like even worse than that, that sometimes when people get so hung up with how these jhanas feel, they kind of try to get at these phenomenologies of jhana, and there's like very different means of getting to the same phenomenology. So at the end, I think I would distinguish a little bit. On the one hand, I would say getting into jhana is great. Like there's a lot of significance in that, but it's kind of more the process, that kind of before and after, instead of the jhana itself. And I think the question here that's really interesting from a computational point of view is that there's lots of models thinking about the entropy of the brain, the randomness, like getting the brain out of like habituated ways of patterns and thinking. And that's like the big narrative from psychedelics. There's like the entropic brain hypothesis, and that basically argues when you take psychedelics, your brain kind of just gets a bit more random. So priors get kind of set a bit more equally. But there's something after jhana where this is only the means to then afterwards very carefully start to set up a new way of perceiving the world, a new way of looking at the world. And there is a certain form of like an active approach where it's not only about letting go, but it's about letting go that you can then deliberately cultivate a way of how you want to perceive the world. And this interplay of letting go and then starting to cultivate new ways of perception, I think that's where the beauty is at in these states.
I literally have goosebumps hearing that, because we talk about that a lot on this show. Like the value of, look, because this is part of my research too, Jonas, like the value of getting out of these locked habitual patterns of thinking. And we talk about that a lot, about how you break those things down. I mean, we've had lots of people come on and talk about psychedelics, which I think is a little bit of a rough hammer in a way, but I love to hear you articulate something much more subtle here, where with a bit of time and effort and skillfulness, you might be able to learn to dip into a kind of high entropy state, if that's what a jhana is. I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about that too. But dip into an altered state in order to come back out and get back to the work of building up good habits. And with that controllability, you can do these little micro doses, it sounds like, as part of your path of self-improvement, rather than having a 15-hour trip that can be good, bad, weird, harmful sometimes, challenging in loads of ways. But to have this sort of skillfulness to go in and out, I mean, wow, it's a very exciting take-home message, actually, that's possible.
And something exciting on this point is like there's two parts. One big part is like actually looking at the brain. But as part of that, I had the huge privilege of speaking with some of these really, really expert meditators that are like, it's really rare to find people that can on will go in and out of these states and these very deep states. Like there's probably more people that can go into these shallow states, but these deep states are very significant. And speaking to them and asking them what's the value for them and how did they get to these jhanas, the most common answer is they all had some practice. They all were kind of trying to cultivate a certain wholesome way of being. And at some point, they just almost came across this thing that there's something about like being very concentrated, like really letting go of all the tension, all the expectations. And then from this point where there's no like fear, no anxiety, then think about like what would be meaningful, what would be the right thing to do, and then kind of engage back in life. And only later they discovered that these are jhanas. So there's this really interesting thing where like it's often, or it's not only the way that people try to get to these jhanas, it's that in a certain way of practice, this is kind of a default mechanism that unfolds a little bit, and then there's refinement to be done. And that's where I think teachers are important.
Right, so it's not Buddhist per se at all, although jhana, I mean, is primarily thought about to be a Buddhist practice today. But rather, you're saying it's just a sort of natural evolution of being in a highly concentrated, highly relaxed state.
Absolutely, and I think there's lots of similarity with flow, and there's lots of similarity with kind of different kind of concentration and well-being practices, and I think that's where I think lots of beautiful conversations can happen in this intersection, and understanding that at the end we are probably doing very similar things across traditions. And one really exciting thing that is coming up now is that we're not only working with jhana practitioners in North America, but also in Asia, in like Thailand, India, Cambodia, maybe Myanmar. And so the interesting thing is we look at the brain, but we also have anthropologists with us that will figure out like what is the cultural patterning and shaping, how do these people talk about it, and what's the influence of culture and context, and what's the kind of underlying mechanism. And what I wouldn't be surprised in finding is that there's a very common mechanism underlying it, which has very different cultural significance in these different states, and what that tells them about like the ontology of the world, about kind of life, about rebirth, about spirits, about entities, about unseen worlds.
Wow, there's so much there, Jamie. I know I'm hogging all the airtime today, but I've got one more. Okay, I love that you're thinking about looking at the cultural significance as well as the neuroscience. The neuroscience is going to be embedded in the cultural significance. The one big cultural difference that I have definitely grokked in the past when it comes to jhana is a teacher, Jay Mickelson, wrote a nice little blurb online about how the jhanas, which were written on even back in the Rig Vedas, so much earlier than Buddhism, they were practices in India, because of course the Buddha went and learned jhana from other teachers before there was Buddhism, right? They were from an earlier tradition. And in that tradition, the stages of jhana were thought about to be nearness to the love of God. That the higher the jhana, the closer to God, and the feelings that you were getting were the feelings of closeness to God, of cleaving, of drawing near to God. So the joy you felt wasn't just joy of the reward system. The joy was the joy of dating God. And then the happiness that came wasn't just serotonin and norepinephrine doing its thing and hitting hedonic hotspots, but that was, now you've moved past dating God and now you've gotten into a relationship with God. So it's the smoothness of a relationship with God. And then the equanimity is the full marriage, where now you're equanimous because now that you're so close to God, you're not worried about anything in the world anymore. So you can cool right out. There's a really significant cultural difference where you have one where it's a nearness, for instance, a nearness to God. And of course, in Buddhism, you strip out some of that language, and now you start thinking about it as refinement of mental phenomenon. And in neuroscience, you might reduce it again to mechanistic plays. But I mean, those are potentially three very different stories, and it would be so interesting to see how they interlock and move forward together.
Absolutely, I love that. It's like it's great, and I think the bit that is so fascinating here, and maybe a bit of a challenge, that like being a neuroscientist, there's often this assumption that like kind of reducing it all, this almost reductionist approach. And I think that works for some things, but you're absolutely right that in my own experience, speaking to different people and interviewing people in different traditions, the context and the explanations they have so much momentum and power in making these states significant. And
Yeah.
Jamie, when you asked earlier about like what's the value of these, well, like what do you get out of these? I think much of that is to be found in this context. And we could go so much in detail, but there's
Yeah.
an interesting link to like the model, because we have this model of the brain that in the predictive processing world, we would say that there's certain expectations or priors we hold, and that like our experience is shaped by the relation of sensory data and our expectations. Now, these entropic states, which most likely jhanas like belong to, are states where these priors are reduced. But that story isn't enough, because what we find is that it's still context and cultural dependent what these people get out of these states. So I think it's a bunch of like conceptual work missing, and like how can it be that these priors are reduced while culture still has such a fundamental impact? And I think that's the edge where I, if possible, would love to advance the field a little bit.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point, because what we're saying is the same things are happening mechanically. The brains would look the same of everyone experiencing the same thing, but the significance would be different, and perhaps the experience and phenomenology would be different because of the meaning we give it.
Absolutely. I think that's white in the center, Jamie.
Well, you can sort of imagine it, right? Like if you're talking about these practices sort of making belief networks a little bit more malleable. And it turns out that belief networks really are what we experience when we experience the world, is we're experiencing our own beliefs about the world. Then you can almost imagine that you've got a kind of permaculture of beliefs. That's your cultural embedding. And that by doing certain practices, you're making some parts of it a bit wobbly. But of course, what continues to grow is going to be the foundation of beliefs that you're embedded within. So that's going to dictate what the growth looks like once you cut it back. It'll be whatever the basis of the forest is, right? I mean, it will just grow back in whatever the shape is that you've tended to hang out in, isn't it?
Yeah, it makes sense. Also, the bed of beliefs you have is kind of your lens, like you're interpreting that experience through
Indeed.
the things you believe.
And there is this really fascinating, it's it's this really interesting, intricate problem at the heart of the math of the active inference, the free energy principle, predictive processing, the Bayesian brain. There's many names for basically a very simple thing, and that's the idea that like we have data coming in and we try to interpret with concepts we have, and we update those things by trying to get a sense of like how close is our interpretation to what is actually out there in the world. Now the challenge here is we don't know what's out there in the world, because only like all we know of what's out there in the world is our interpretation, which is already using our priors. So what we need to do is we need to like simulate or figure out, like use all info we have to figure out what's out there in the world, and speaking to others, and like we're social animals in the end, and speaking to others and having kind of narratives and stories. I think that's why so many traditions have like these verbal traditions of passing on stories. They give us a bit of a sense, like a bit of a framework that helps us to make sense of this data. And that's, I think, why culture and this kind of culture, which is often conceived as so broad, at the end is so fundamental to our very like minimalistic perceptual processes, because our perceptual apparatus is trained on what culture tells us. And there we span from like a very like moment to moment perception to grand cultural scheme. And what meditation can allow us, and kind of the observation of our own thought allows us to kind of observe that stack, and kind of see if there's maybe like a few pitfalls that we're doing in these inferences, and allows us to refine that in ways that seem malleable. And I think meditation has two fantastic advantages here. One, it allows us to set the precisions in a more meaningful and accurate way. But second, if all goes well, meditation comes with a bit of a community, with people that you can speak with about what the meaning of life is, what a good life is. And at the end, I think and I think that's different. Like in some cultures, that's kind of necessarily a religious context, because religion carries the kind of function of talking about a good life. But it could also be just a context outside of religion, just coming together
Yeah.
with friends, talking about things that go well, that go bad, giving inspiration, giving a bit of like an outside reflection, because these exchanges are the kind of data points we need to
Yeah.
update our own kind of generative model.
Even challenging your beliefs, right? Like giving you better evidence. I was just speaking on gaslighting, And I think they were expecting me, gaslighting is, right, where somebody like undermines your confidence in the world. And I think the people that I was speaking to were expecting me to just say, well, gaslighting is super bad. I mean, of course it is. But actually, the other part of the talk was that the narrative we have about where everybody is gaslighting you is also harmful because it stops you from getting into meaningful conflicts with other people, because conflict isn't synonymous with gaslighting. People are allowed to have different opinions and bump into each other and speak cross purposes. But you need that. You also need a bit of grind, because you need to check to see whether or not your beliefs are valuable or not. And it's no good to just defend yourself from getting into meaningful conflict by saying, hey, you're abusing me by sort of having a different opinion than me, or telling me that, what I believe is maybe not accurate. But we really need that. So, I mean, community turns out to be so important for a system that perceives based on its beliefs, isn't it?
And maybe there's, if I can just throw it in, another project that we're starting to work on is exactly this point, that maybe it's not only the community, but maybe there's something about combining the meditation practice with community. But the meditation practice makes you able to open more wholeheartedly to the community, makes you align more closely, makes you kind of changes the relationship. And there's a new technique where you do neuroscience not only on single brains, but on multiple brains, and where you can analyze the synchrony and the alignment of people, the kind of the causal network in groups. And that's what we're doing with people that are praying in churches. Like, they pray together, and we see how is like prayer opening up people's ability to relate to one another. And the idea is to do the same in meditation. And the interesting thing that points at is that it allows us to be challenged, to be open up, to like be really receptive to what other people say. And it also comes with the challenge that makes us vulnerable to adopt beliefs that might be not so well. And there is potentially a big problem of adopting kind of belief patterns that are coming from a place of bad intention, or skillfulness.
So we've got these low jack ways that we can entrain with one another. That seems very valuable, especially if you're with a wise person. I mean, Socrates? No, Aristotle, who said, to be a friend of most. And you say, well, how do I become wise? And Aristotle would say, well, go hang out with wise people. Because I don't have what you want to do is you want to be entrained. You want to go and find somebody wise and hang out with them. And then maybe somehow by osmosis, you'll learn the right way to tune to the world. So we have these low jack ways of resonating with one another, for better or for worse, because of course it can go wrong too, can't it?
And that's the question, linking it back to what we spoke about jhana, where in psychedelics we already know that psychedelics makes you susceptible for false beliefs. They allow you to kind of actually get worse if you're not in a good context and setting. And in meditation, there's sometimes this assumption that meditation is always good, and that doing kind of jhanas and peak experiences is always good.
Yeah.
But although that seems to be the case for many people, there are also cases where these states allow you to adopt beliefs that aren't really beneficial.
Yeah.
And I think that's might be a very similar mechanism than in psychedelics, that then having a good community, having good support, having good teachers, I think is something that is quite central here in really getting the best out of these states.
So just to bring this back now to the science for a moment, we have like these jhana states we're imagining happen on the mat in meditation. Is there something distinct you could see across 10 people having the same jhana state? Would we see the same activity in the brain?
Well, before I speak of the brain, I think is it even the same experience for these 10 people?
Yeah, hard to know, isn't it?
In some ways, it is. But there's this beautiful thing where I had these long 2-3 hour interviews with all the 10 people we worked with. And surprisingly, everyone reported things slightly different. And even more, we then kind of brought up things that previous people said. And people were like, whoa, that's so different. I never thought of it that way. And like I never perceived it that way. So the same tradition, the same people, but it's so interesting that there's almost this assumption you don't speak about these deep states. It's like they're kind of private, they're hidden. They're like, if you speak about it, it's kind of, it's not really perceived that well in the community often. So I think there's one question, is it even experientially the same, or is it a bit different across people? And then if we speak of the brain, we're still in the very early stages of the data analysis. So there's nothing final I can say on what the brain really looks like. But the kind of tentative findings tend to be consistent on the fact that the brain gets less agitated by distractions in the outside world, by anomalies, by kind of patterns that are unexpected, and also seems to be the case that the brain seems to be in slightly higher entropic states, which is a bit similar to what psychedelics are doing.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So, are there any distinct markers? Are there any things that happen in the brain that you go, oh my God, that's a jhana, and it couldn't be anything else?
Nice.
No, I love that. I hope to find that. If
Yeah.
we're able to find that, and that's I think what motivates this research is that might be a really solid marker of well-being. So many states of consciousness are so diverse, they combine so many different experiences that it's hard to isolate what of these things is the well-being and what is other things. And jhana states are states that are so pure that there's in some ways really nothing left but well-being. So if we know the signature of the brain signature of jhana, that might be the brain signature of well-being or something very close to that.
I love that because one thing, and if it didn't come out yet for our listeners, I mean, jhanas are highly exclusionary, full focus concentration states. And what might not be obvious is you can't bully your way. You can't bully your way into these states. You can't force your way into these states. They emerge when the distractions get swept out of the house. And the distractions are things like attachment and aversion and misunderstanding and sleepiness and stress and anxiety. So actually you have to, when you sweep all of that stuff out of the house, then the mind can, only then can it go into these sort of effortless altered state pockets, at least temporarily. So I hear exactly what you're saying, Jonas. Like if you hit that marker, then it's going to mean that you've come into the kind of relationship with your own mind and with the world such that the house can be swept empty occasionally of all of these problems. I mean, of course, they're going to come back for a long time because everything is cyclical and they come in waves, but it does mean that you're capable of temporarily moving the issues outside to enjoy what a mind would be like without all of the sort of push and pull things happening.
And the exciting thing here is that it's so rare that we have really good data on jhana meditators. There's like 3 studies or so out there,
Yeah.
and they either like it's a single participant or it's
Yeah.
like so. There's nothing out there. Like no one has done like a really serious investigation of jhana, and there's a few other kind of projects underway, but all of them are kind of taking a kind of a more diverse group of people. And because there is such like jhana is such a broad term, I think we are really the only project that has a group that is so synonymous, is so expert, and we have been at a 10-day meditation retreat where we collected data for a bunch of days in a row, and there is a few other projects coming up where we kind of collect data from like a specific teacher, a bunch of students. So this is really the first time that we have a sense of what's really going on in the brain, and so this makes this project really, really unique and incredibly, incredibly exciting.
And I don't know if you know, Jamie, but I was there pulling
Yeah,
data with
that was
Jonas at the Jhana retreat. So I got to play experimental assistant. It was amazing. Great opportunity.
yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
the
you so
interesting
much for that, Mark. That's been such a fantastic 10 days.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the interesting question then is like whether the research into jhanas generalizes at all in a useful way for other peak states research, and whether there's anything that's in here, because as you say, it's very specific, or rather, this is one of the only studies on jhana specifically. But are there lessons that emerge or conclusions that emerge that are helpful elsewhere?
I very much hope so. And in particular, the thing that I'm most looking forward to analyzing here and looking at is how jhana states are different to the psychedelic state and different to brain scans of psychedelics. Because both of these states seem to be very, very similar in regards to being considered high entropic states. So like kind of being a bit more random, allowing you to get out of habituated ways of perceiving and out of these pockets. So reducing your expectations on the world. But jhanas are different to psychedelics in that they have like very high precision on control. They do like very high on control. So the interesting thing here is that we might be able to understand this additional component of how can control and deliberate control be added to these entropic states. And I think that can be really meaningful if we then go back to kind of psychedelics and other high, like peak experiences. Might be breathing, may it be substance induced, may it be through sport or so, where I think we can learn a little bit in now getting a classifier that allows us to look at what level of control is present in these other states, because taking jhanas is like the high end of controllability that allows us to have a new marker for looking at this dimension of control or self-control in these other states.
It's interesting. I'm wondering just out loud when you mentioned sort of sport there, whether like people have had experiences just in their day-to-day life, peak concentration flow experiences, that and whether jhana is the same thing, just more extreme, or whether it's like a slightly different beast.
There's one really interesting anecdote where one of our participants, and maybe one of the, like all the 10 people are really experienced, and one of the people that seems to be even on the experienced end of that group. And we talked about their first jhana experience. And what they shared is that they've been an extreme climber at some point, and that they've been climbing and been out in the walk, and we're doing like a really challenging tour this one day, much longer, much more challenging than what they've done before. And there's this thing if you're two people, one person climbs, the other person then kind of secures and you change. And at one point they were just sitting there and nothing mattered anymore. It was the most beautiful and clear state. There was nothing distracting. And that person then started to figure out what was the state? What was this thing from one moment to the other? It's been no stress, no fear, only bliss. And that turned out to be their first jhana experience. And then they seeked like advice from teachers, and then kind of got into getting back to this state with more controllability. But this was something that happened kind of random, and I believe that, or I wouldn't be surprised if there's many people out there that experience these states in like random occasions in life. And at the end, it's just, well, it's chance. It's like you fall into these. It's our conscious state. It's like it's this vast space, and we kind of wander around a bit randomly. And sometimes you fall into these pockets, and there's this one thing that Mark loves to say, and I've taken it so much to heart, is you just increase your chance of like the likelihood of falling into these pockets. It's not that you change something fundamentally. You just change the likelihood of accidentally tripping into these states of joy.
I mean, you can get a sense of why it would be valuable. Like, I mean, just not in like a formal practice called jhana, but why it might be valuable to have these moments of extreme flow. Because like imagine like you're always in some ways holding the baggage of your future and of your past in play. So they're in play in the background, which probably gives us a background sense of being anxious and being worried, being weighed down. And also we take them very seriously, and we think they're very, very real. They have a real immediacy, this idea that we have a future filled with concerns and a past filled with concerns. But that's much more malleable than maybe we tend to think about it. And if you can have a moment where all of that collapses because you're so present, either because what you're doing is so dangerous, like climbing, or because you're right on the edge of your abilities, or because you've taken a psychedelic, or because you've practiced in order to let go of all of the future and past stuff, so you just show up here. I mean, just getting a sense, one of the things that seems valuable about that is you temporarily let down all of your future and past expectations. And the value there is that by letting it down and then picking it back up again, and hopefully doing that a few times, you learn that actually the future and past can be let down and can be picked back up. It's not as real as it might feel like it's real, because now you've had the experience of being without it and then it turning back on and being without it. I guess near-death experiences are probably very similar to that. Suddenly, all of the things that you thought to be persistent and real crumble. And at the other side, there's a lot more fluidity and flexibility because you're not stuck in those same long distance networks.
Yeah,
Mark, do you remember? Sorry.
there's even some that where there's the idea that these jhana states and these absorption states, that they're in some sort preparing you for death, where you've just been going through the cycle of like all your experience kind of crumbling a bunch of times, and by the time death comes, and by the time it actually crumbles for the last time, and you're body that
It's just another crumbling experience, just like you've gone through 10,000 times in your life. Oh.
Why does it feel nice though? It's interesting, right? Because like there's nothing inherent to that statement that makes me think, oh, lovely. Like I
there is
know because of the context of the chat, it feels good, but why is it?
there is it's an exciting topic, and I think there's I know that Mark is doing a bunch of really exciting research, and a few other friends kind of just named that there's Lars Sandberg Smith, and there's people at Monash that do exciting work on this. So I think it's under construction to figure this out. But one of the consensus in the active inference, or like the mathematics of cognition, is that the valence, or like how beautiful, like how nice or negative something feels, is how good you are in predicting what you perceive. And there's this term, this prediction error, the mismatch of what you expect to perceive and what is actually coming in at sensory data. And the more accurate that is, the better you feel, and the more offset that is, there's kind of this uncomfort, almost this like something is not right, my model is not right, and that's why we have this feeling of discomfort. That's kind of just a marker to tell the system, oh, you're not performing very well, we need to do something, like alert, alert, you need to kind of shape your expectations, your something to get back on track. And now there's two ways in how we can match our expectation with the perception of the world. We can either make the world align with our expectations, and that's, I think, what happens so often in life. We have this idea that we're like this kind of person, maybe the successful person, maybe this person that has like a lot of money, or this person that's like extra nice, or this person that has like the nicest room, and then we get like all crazy, but like always like really agitatedly keeping our room nice or trying to get successful because that's the image we have for ourselves. But there's another trick to align these two things, and that's to just let go of your expectations and let your expectations flow always to where perception is. To not hold on to anything that is different, to not hold on to counterfactual worlds. And so I think that is what's happening in kind of expert like meditation states, that you let go, you just let go of what you believe the world is, and you just let your beliefs like very closely follow the data that's coming in. And then it goes a bit deeper than that, because you can then start to taking the object that you observe, being the sensory data, to observing the processes by which sensory data is processed. And Thomas Metzinger has done really, really great work on the phenomenology of like the minimal self here. And he has this fantastic line where he says, by the time you've observed the process of perception to such a degree that it takes up all of your consciousness, the thing that you're actually perceiving is fading away. So there's no tracking of the mismatch between your expectations of the world and the world. And that is then even going a bit beyond jhana. There's something called cessation experiences, where even the joy of the meditation fades away, and you're just in this state of nothingness, you may even say of neither perception or non-perception. There's not even a part of you that is not perceiving. And so totally abandoning these mismatches, I think, is where the beauty lies. But I think to caveat all that, that's a state that is temporarily really nice. These counterfactual beliefs of the world are incredibly important to function in this world. Like,
That's right.
if I wanna do something, if I want to do a certain action, if I want to go to the bathroom or like have some food, I need to start to kind of think about the world of how that would be like, and create this mismatch. And this mismatch of I want to eat, there's no food here, how do I get that line? That's what allows me to move around in this world. So it's not that the state of letting go of the priors is where we want to be forever. It's kind of going there to then be able to reconstruct our expectations of the world in a way that seems meaningful in achieving the goals that we want to achieve in like a very wholesome way.
I love that. So just having like a moderate, more flexibility and fluidity, but of course not too much, because psychotypical, schizophrenia, for instance, is potentially too much flexibility in those belief systems. So having the right amount of flexibility, it's sort of a moving target, isn't it? To have not too much stability, not too much flexibility, but find something right in the middle.
Yeah, Jonas, before we finish up, is there a practical edge to this research? Is there
Nice.
anything you would advise someone to go and do? Perhaps someone without a meditation practice, or perhaps someone without a great prior interest in this?
Fantastic. Um, it's a great question. I think really at the heart of why we're doing this research. Um, there's one thing that I came to realize when working with these different meditators and these different people, and that seems to be that pretty much for all of them, there is this idea of just figuring out who they are, what's doing good for them, and doing that in conversation with good friends and good people. And that seems to take a bit of priority over doing a specific meditation technique,
Nice.
over getting into jhana, over like kind of getting into these peak experiences. And I think I mentioned at the beginning that sometimes these peak states are more byproduct of like investigating who we are in a very wholesome life. And I think that's really what I coming into this research, I thought I'm doing this research on these peak experience because then I learn what they are and I can just do them all day long myself. And maybe the one thing I've learned is that there's much less value in striving for those than I thought. That the whole context around it seems much, much more important. So maybe the practices that I could recommend is have a tea with a good friend and a good chat. Go for a nice walk and enjoy the sun outside. Um, that's I think what some people practice a bunch of meditation to figure out how beautiful these things are, and maybe you can just start with a good tea and a good conversation.
Yeah, there's an irony there, right? Because jhanas are in some ways quite lofty states and difficult to achieve, but it's like the whole hero's journey. Like you work out that the pot of gold was there the whole time, you know?
Yeah.
And it's valuable, right? Like there's not it's not an either or. It's not that you can listen to this and you're like, oh, drinking tea is the trick, and then you stop meditating. Go meditate. Meditation is fantastic. It really like it's probably the thing that has been giving me so much joy and floatiness, and that at the end gives me kind of the lightheartedness in doing this research, which honestly being an academic is hard, and I think having a practice like this really really sustains me and gives me a lot of positive kind of encouragement. But the periods where I get too cringy and where I like put all my hope of being living a good life into my practice going well, those are usually the times when practice is going the worst. And so those are also the times where I don't remember this. So maybe I'll listen to this podcast next time I'm there.
Yeah. Great.
Jonas, thank you so much for coming on. Everyone, that was the Contemplative Science podcast. I hope that was as much fun to listen to as it was to record. And as always, we'll see you next week.